Welcome to what I hope will be the first of many study sessions that I'm recording. I've been leading study sessions at Congregation Shir Tikva for years, and periodically I get requests from people expressing regret that they missed a session. Is it possible to upload the study materials or do it again or something like that? So I've decided to start recording. These are all study sessions that I've led in the past. Now I'm going to record them, unfortunately, without a group to participate, so that won't be quite as good, but it's better than nothing. By the way, I'm Larry Booker, and I should say that I'm not a rabbi and that these sessions represent my own views, not those of Shir Tikva or its rabbi. So today, I want to start with a session called Tzedakah 102, the details. And the reason I'm calling it that is that Shir Tikva had a number of previous sessions that were essentially Tzedakah 101, giving the basics that tzedakah is usually translated as charity, but that doesn't really capture the meaning. Tzedakah is based on the Hebrew word tzedek, which means righteousness or justice. And charity is something that people give out of the goodness of their hearts. Tzedakah is a requirement. Even people who are poor and receive tzedakah are required to give some of what they receive as tzedakah to somebody else. So that's sort of the basics of tzedakah, but what are the details? And I first started thinking about this when the question popped into my head. Does donating money to a political party count as tzedakah? And in the United States, with our tax codes, we tend to think about whether something is tax deductible, and then it's all the same, right? So if you give money to help feed poor people, that's a charitable deduction. It's tax-free money. If you donate money to cure cancer, that's also a tax deduction. And if you give money to a political party or any kind of cause, as long as it's a nonprofit, that's also tax-free money. But surely those aren't all in the same category, and I doubt that Judaism and Jewish law see them as being in the same category. So I wanted to do some research. And this is what I came up with. And so the first thing that I want to do is bring up the study sheet. Um, okay, I am going to do a screen share so that you can look at the study materials. So hopefully you are seeing the handout. And I want to start with the motivation for this, which comes from the Unatane Tokef prayer. The Unatane Tokef prayer is the one that we say during the high holidays that's really depressing and kind of creepy because it talks about all the horrible things that may happen to us in the coming year. Talk who will die by fire and who will die by water. But then it ends with one line of hope. And it's, but teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah, repentance, prayer, and charity can remove the severity of the decree. That translation is from the Machzor Hadash, which Shir Tikva used for many years. Our current Machzor translates this very differently, but this translation is close to the literal meaning. Teshuvah, tefillah. Teshuvah is repentance. Tefillah is prayer. And tzedakah, they're translating as charity, even though it really isn't. Can remove the severity of the decree. Hey, giving tzedakah can save your life. If that's the case, don't you want some details like what counts as tzedakah and how much do I need to give? Right? It seems kind of important. So And I should say that in all of these study sessions, I like to use classic rabbinic texts. This doesn't mean I accept them as authoritative. I don't always agree with them. Shirtef is a reform and renewal congregation. We don't always buy into classic rabbinic texts, but I think they're a really good starting point for discussion. So here's what the Shulchan Aruch has to say. That's probably the most authoritative book of a guide to Jewish living. The first year you should give a tenth of the principal, and thereafter you should give a tenth of the profits you earn each year after deducting your household expenses. The commandment is fulfilled in its excellence when you give a fifth. You should not give away more than a fifth so that you will not become dependent on others. But as a dying bequest, you are permitted to donate up to a third of your estate. Okay, now we got some details. So you're supposed to give somewhere between 10 and 20%. When you're first starting up and you don't have any profit, you're supposed to give 10% of your possessions. Hey, in modern terms, that sounds like a wealth tax to me, kind of controversial. Um, and then, by the way, Shulchan Aruch is 16th century. Well, in the 19th century, no, I'm sorry, in the 18th century, a guy named the Vilna Gaon comes along. Some authorities say that giving a fifth is for the wealthy only, but the Vilna Gaon says it may also depend on community needs. If there are still hungry people after everyone's given a tenth, generous people should step up and give more. Okay, kind of like that. Um, all don't limitations on donations don't apply when a life is at stake. So you can give more to redeem a captive whose life is in danger, as long as doing so doesn't endanger your own life. Okay, let's dig into some details. Feeding your family counts as a household expense, but not as tzedakah. However, you know what? Let me just stop right there. You might want to think about things the same way we do in modern terms with tax codes, that there are deductions, and a deduction reduces the amount of the taxable income. And then there are some things where it counts as if you had given it. That's a credit. When something counts as a credit, that's just flat off taken off your taxes, not the taxable income. So this is saying feeding your family counts as a household expense. It's a deduction, but it doesn't count as tzedakah, which would be a credit. Okay. However, feeding an adopted orphan counts as tzedakah. That might sound terrible to some of us, um, but it also might be a mistranslation. Maybe adopted orphan just means not that you've legally adopted, but some kid has wandered into your house off the street and you give him a sandwich. That counts as tzedakah. Um, okay. And then already in the 19th century, we've got people disagreeing with this. This is the Chofetz Chaim. He lived in the 19th century. He should therefore train himself to deduct a tenth from the total income God grants him. Hey, there's the motivation for giving tzedakah. None of what we have is ours. It all comes from God. Of this amount, he should spend two-thirds on charity gifts, the demand for which is the greater, and one-third should be held in his possession for giving free loans. He should from then on allocate all his tithes for charity gifts alone. Okay, so first off, the Chofetz Chaim disagreed with the Shulchan Aruch about deducting household expenses. He thinks it's 10% of your income without any deductions. And then secondly, he's saying, well, there's a couple different ways of giving charity. You can just give people money or you can loan them money. And some of you may know that there's Maimonides had a ladder of different types of tzedakah and which are better than others. And Maimonides thought that was the highest form of charity, where you give somebody a loan or teach them a trade so that they can become self-sufficient in the future. Okay. Um, how do you keep track of all of this? Well, this is what the Chafetz Chaim claimed, again, 19th century, pre-computer. One, declare you are not taking a vow to fulfill the mitzvah. Jewish law is very, very suspicious of vow taking and tries to avoid it whenever possible. Keep a special account book of net earnings, balance it semi-annually or at least annually. Enter all sums dispensed to charity. If at the time of balancing the dispensed amount is less than the requirement, distribute it. If there aren't any poor people around, you can hang on to the money until they show up. The money can be used for your own purposes. In the meantime, well, that sounds a little dangerous. If your donations exceed your obligation, some authorities allow you to carry the balance forward to the next year. Some authorities are stricter. I don't know. Has this ever in Jewish history been a thing where Jews had more money to donate to tzedakah than there were poor people to receive it? This sounds like one of those theoretical things rabbis argue about that never actually happens. And then he also gave some motivation for setting money aside, right? At the start of the year, when somebody shows up at your door begging for money, you don't look in your wallet and see if you have any. You've already set the money aside. It's sitting there in a desk drawer, it's in a bowl next to the front door, something like that, and it's ready to go. Another advantage of setting aside money for tzedakah is that once the money has been set aside, the other members of his family can also participate in the mitzvah. For instance, when he is away on business or when he is asleep, other people too can learn to emulate his act and he will be acceptable to God since he has set the example. This is the meaning of the statement. Rabbi Shimon said, there are three crowns, the crown of learning, the crown of priesthood, and the crown of royalty, but the crown of a good name exceeds them all. By the way, the book this is taken from is called Ahavat Chesed, um, the love of loving kindness, or the love of kindness. So that's kind of what this book is about. Um, so this is kind of cool. You put the money in a bowl, a table next to the front door, and you're out on business, and a poor person comes to the door and asks for money, and your kids are home. They take money out of the bowl and give it to them. And they start getting trained in giving tzedakah. This is kind of cool. By the way, I should apologize for the language, not exactly gender neutral. This is one of the disadvantages of using classic rabbinic texts. They weren't always the most politically correct. Okay, what counts as tzedakah? Does a donation to a political cause count? Does a donation to cure a disease count? If you or someone you love is suffering from that disease, this is something I thought of, right? So, if I donate money to cure some disease, that's one thing. But if I've got that disease, aren't I spending that money for my own benefit? Does that still count as tzedakah? This is the way my brain works. I apologize. So let's go to the Talmud. The Gemara asks, and in a case like that, where there is personal interest intermingled with the performance of a mitzvah, is it not nevertheless considered a mitzvah? But wasn't it taught the one who says, I'm contributing this seller to charity so that my son will live, or if he says, I'm performing the mitzvah so that I will be the one destined for the world to come, this person is a full-fledged righteous person as far as the mitzvah is concerned. These ulterior motives, seeking a reward, do not detract from the value of the mitzvah. So this is one opinion from the Talmud. By the way, I should explain that phrase, the world to come, is the way that Talmud frequently refers to as a positive afterlife. You can think of it as heaven. You can think of it as reincarnation or resurrection or whatever the reward is in the afterlife. The same applies wherever one expects also to derive some benefit. The reason is that the person has obeyed God's will in saying he gives the coin to charity, even though he also desired to derive some benefit. His mitzvah is not nullified. So this is the Chafetz Chaim commenting on that Talmudic passage that we just read. He agrees. Yay. Let's have another opinion. This is from Rav Yehuda. Even a mitzvah performed with ulterior motives garners reward, as Rav Yehuda said that Rav said. A person should always engage in Torah study and performance of mitzvot, even if he does so not for their own sake, as through the performance of mitzvot not for their own sake, one gains understanding and comes to perform them for their own sake. So this is a much more general principle. It doesn't just apply to tzedakah, it applies to all the mitzvot. And it's fake it till you make it. Do the mitzvah even if you're not feeling it in your heart. Eventually you'll start feeling it in your heart. That's how I interpret it. Okay, a few more details. You may not use your charity funds for other mitzvah obligations, such as buying candles for the synagogue or other items used for a mitzvah, but you must give it to the poor. Money, according to this, it looks to me like giving money to your synagogue doesn't count as tzedakah. That's a big difference because our tax codes say that it's a non-taxable deduction. Um, but this is saying no, you have an obligation to contribute to your synagogue. That's a separate obligation. It's separate from tzedakah, and it doesn't count. Loans to the poor count as tzedakah according to the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, but not according to Ramban. He considers it a separate mitzvah. Ah, these rabbis. So Ramban has to disagree with him, even though there's no difference, right? They're both they're both a mitzvah. Is it the same mitzvah or a different mitzvah? Who cares? I'm not sure. A distinction without a difference. Okay, now let's get to the question that I was asking about donations to causes and cures and stuff like that. So what about causes other than hunger and homelessness? The Chafetz Chaim cites some authorities who say that tzedakah money can only be given to the poor and not for any other mitzvah purpose. But he disagrees and says it's okay to provide money to allow a bride and groom to marry, or for a brit milah, that's a ritual circumcision. He also believes tzedakah money can also be used to allow a poor person to buy an aliyah. Okay, so shir tikva, you don't buy aliyahs. We give them out for free. But there was a time when selling of aliyahs was a way for a synagogue to raise money. It would have gone out of business otherwise. I don't want to pass judgment on the way they ran their synagogues back then. Let's try to be non-judgmental about that. But okay, you're selling an aliyah. There's a poor person. He wants the honor of coming up and reading from the Torah, but he can't afford it. If you buy the aliyah for him, that counts as tzedakah, according to the Chafetz Chaim. And also allowing a bride and groom to marry, right? People want to get married. They don't have the money for a wedding. Maybe they don't have enough money for a marriage license. Giving them that money, it's not for feeding, clothing, housing. It's for something else. Still counts as tzedakah. Again, according to the Chafetz Chaim, who's a pretty authoritative guy. The Shulchan Aruch maintains, and again, this is that guidebook to Jewish living, that one who has funds to spare could do no better with them than to assist in the marrying off of poor young women. Not only is it allowed to count as tzedakah, it's the best kind of tzedakah. Another priority in charitable giving is Torah education. But buying books of Jewish learning counts as tzedakah only if you're willing to loan them out to scholars. But you get first dibs on reading them, okay? So if I buy books for a Torah scholar, that's tzedakah. If I buy books for myself to study Torah, that's not tzedakah. If I allow other scholars to come into my house and borrow those books, now it's tzedakah again. Oh, are we down in the weeds now? Now let's get to something maybe more relevant. Paying Jewish nonprofit professionals counts. So the money you pay to support people who collect donations from the community and distribute it to those in need also counts as tzedakah. Okay. Now we're getting close to donations to a synagogue, aren't we? But this does say that, people collect money for tzedakah and distribute it, and sometimes they take a salary for themselves. That's okay. The money that went to their salary counts as tzedakah. Campaign contributions. It could be argued that this counts as supporting community leaders, but we should be skeptical. Okay, supporting community leaders, that was the category we just talked about. That counts as tzedakah. What about elected officials? Does that come under the category of community leaders? If I were doing this in a room full of people, I would stop right here and ask for opinions. This is what study sessions should be. Let's hear what, and we've already had a bunch of other things where you may be disagreeing with what's in here, or you want to express an opinion. By the way, you're welcome to watch this session with other people and have your own discussions. That would be wonderful. Okay. Concentration or diversification? Is it better to give a large lump sum or multiple small donations? Okay, so the first opinion we're going to get is from Maimonides. And I already mentioned Maimonides wrote a lot about tzedakah and the details of tzedakah. And by the way, he was 12th century. And he came up with this ladder of higher and higher levels with tzedakah. We're not going to go, I consider that Tzedakah 101. Okay, what did he have to say about large lump sums versus multiple small donations? The higher levels will not be obtained by an individual through the magnitude of an action, but rather through a multitude of actions. For example, when an individual gives 1,000 gold coins to a needy person, and to another person gives nothing, he will not acquire the quality of generosity through this one action as much as one who donates 1,000 gold coins in 1,000 instances and gives every coin in the spirit of generosity. Because the latter repeated the act of generosity 1,000 times and achieved a strong acquisition, while the former aroused his soul to do a good once and then ceased. Okay, so a couple things, and to me, this is related to that fake it until you make it. You keep giving tzedakah, and then you give tzedakah again, and even if you're not feeling it, you're not in the mood, it doesn't uplift you, whatever, you're doing it because it's a requirement or because you want to save your life, according to the Unatane Tokef prayer. Eventually, if you keep giving over and over and over again, you'll start feeling it. It'll become a habit with you, but also it will change you. Again, this would be a great topic for discussion, especially if there was anyone in the group who had taken some psychology classes or had experience with donations. I do want to point out that Maimonides considers it important to donate in the spirit of generosity. Better giving than not giving. But it's better to give in a spirit of generosity than to give grudgingly. That was part of his ladder of higher and higher tzedakah. Okay, even if this is not a correct reading of Maimonides, it is explicitly the position of the Bayit Chadash, the Bach. Let me take a quick glance here. Yeah, the Bach was Joel Circus, 16th to 17th century, who lived in Brest-Litovsk, where my bubby came from. In the laws of giving to the poor on Purim, the Bach states that it is clear to him that one who could give a large gift to one needy person or smaller gifts to 100 should opt for the latter route, thus sustaining 100 lives. This notion is alluded to in the Talmud, where it recorded that one who offers all his priestly gifts to one Kohen starves the world. Oh, I'd love to have a discussion on that too. Um, Go ahead. Pause this right now. Give it a little bit of thought. You agree with that? That you got a bunch of gifts to give. You could give it to a bunch of priests, or you could give it to one priest. If you give it to one priest, you're starving the world. Okay. Once again, back to the Chofetz Chaim. When a person gives a number of loans, each for a small amount as is customary, he can perform hundreds of positive mitzvot in the course of 1 year. This would not be so if he lent a single large sum to one individual. In the same period, he might only perform a few mitzvot. Similarly, the Tana has laid down, this is from Pirkei Avot, which is Mishnah, has laid down that the world is judged by grace, yet all is in accord with the majority of deeds. The Rambam has noted that the Mishnah does not read the greatness of the deed, but the majority of the deeds, since the performance of many good deeds is preferable, even though each act by itself is of less significance than the performance of one single great deed. So in this case, Chofetz Chaim is agreeing with Maimonides, giving slightly different reasoning, essentially based on grammar, the singular and plural of this phrase. Okay, who should you give it to? Should you give it to poor people? Should you give it to causes? Should you give it to starving people in Africa? Should you give it to hungry people more local? Okay. Perhaps the most famous principle of prioritization is that of Aniye Ircha Kodmim. The poor of your city take precedence, indicating the preference to those in close proximity. The Meiri, this is 13th century, the Meiri was Menachem Meiri. The Meiri maintains that this is the overriding priority and all other factors are evaluated only within this context. The poor of your city take precedence. Or here's another opinion. The neediest come first. This is the dominant rule according to Panim Yafot, overriding even the priority of Aniye Ircha. Panim Yafot, actually, we're not even sure exactly who it is, but it might be Rabbi Pinchas Horowitz, 18th century Hasidic. Okay, so do you give it to the most local people or do you give it to the neediest people, even if they're further away? The next prioritized category in the distribution of charity is Aniyei Eretz Yisrael, the poor of the land of Israel. And again, this principle came up before the creation of the state of Israel. They were just talking about the land of Israel. There have always been Jews living somewhere near Jerusalem, even when it was under British rule, Ottoman rule, Crusader rule, Mameluke rule, Abbasid, Umayyad, whoever was ruling, there were always Jews living there, and they were frequently poor. Okay, so next you give to the land of Israel. The Chatam Sofer posits that within this category, the poor of Jerusalem take precedence over those of other cities, since the sanctity of the city outlasts the destruction of the temple. Okay, the Chatam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Schreiber, early 19th century. You know what? I should probably point this out. They're calling him the Chatam Sofer. That was the name of a book he wrote. This is really common among famous rabbis. They're often referred to by their most famous book. You know, um, it's as if, Mark Twain were being referred to as Huckleberry Finn or something. It seems kind of weird, but it's very common. So Moshe Schreiber writes a book called Chatan Sofer, meaning sign of the scribe. And then forever afterwards, people talk about him as the Chatan Sofer. By the way, the same is true with that Chofetz Chaim guy. That wasn't his real name. That was the name of one of his books. A digression. Okay. So what do we think about this? You're supposed to give money first to the people of your city, and secondly to the land of Israel, to poor Jews living in the land of Israel. But the Jews living in Jerusalem take priority over, let's say, the Jews living in Hebron or Jaffa or someplace like that, because I don't know. I'm not sure I buy this. Just because Jerusalem is more holy than Jaffa, should a poor person living in Jaffa suffer for that? I'm not sure I buy that. But at any rate, that was the Chatam Sofer. Let's go back to the Chofetz Chaim for a minute. According to him, relatives take priority over strangers. Ooh, man, is this a good time for a discussion? One can even support parents with tzedakah money, but only if one has no other means. After relatives, the money should go to Torah scholars. Hey, Chofetz Chaim was a Torah scholar. I wonder if that influenced his opinion on that. But it is true, the Torah scholars, if they're doing it full time, are always poor. You don't make money being a Torah scholar, or at least you didn't prior to the 20th century. Even then, probably not. Um, okay. Um, I don't know. Have a discussion. Should your priority be based on local, Holy Land, neediest, Torah scholar, relatives? Uh, it's there's a lot of possibilities, and as you can see, the rabbis don't all agree on this. Okay, one other little bit of trivia here. Why is there no bracha when giving tzedakah? Okay, so most of the commandments that we do, or at least many of them, there's a bracha that you recite, right? Um, in which we thank God for commanding us to do whatever. So let's say it's a commandment to light Shabbos candles. Okay, we light Shabbos candles and then say a bracha about being commanded to light Shabbos candles. We're commanded to give tzedakah. Why don't we say a bracha when we give tzedakah? According to the Rashba, mitzvot that require another person don't get a bracha since we can't guarantee the mitzvah will happen after saying the bracha. What if the intended recipient turns down the donation, right? So a guy shows up at the door and says, I'm hungry. I haven't eaten in 3 days. Um, you run into the kitchen, you grab a tuna sandwich and bring it to the door. You say a bracha for tzedakah, hand him the sandwich. He goes, I don't really like tuna. No, thank you. Well, now you've said the bracha, but you didn't fulfill the mitzvah. That's really bad in Jewish law. It's an example of taking God's name in vain. That's why you always say the bracha immediately before fulfilling it, because you don't want to take the chance of saying the bracha and then not fulfilling it. Um, and my understanding is that there's a part of a Jewish wedding where there could be a bracha, but there isn't because, what if you're doing the marriage ceremony, you recite the bracha for getting married, and then the other person changes their mind, leaves you at the chuppah. Anyway, the Rambam says we shouldn't say a bracha for mitzvot between people because the timing might be critical. Okay, so it's a mitzvah to save somebody's life. You see somebody drowning in a swimming pool, you're about to dive in and save them, and you go, oh, let me say the bracha for saving somebody's life. No, no, no. That would be terrible. Okay, we're finally at the end. Conclusion. The Vilna Gaon is quoted. By the way, let's talk for a second about the Vilna Gaon. This is a title. A Gaon is a title of respect for great scholars. He lived in the city of Vilna, Lithuania. So he was the Vilna Gaon. He's usually seen historically as the leader against the Hasidic movement. And there's some question about how true that is, but he's seen as as the exemplar of rationalism in Judaism, anti-mysticism, but he was a brilliant scholar, and so everyone respects him, even the Hasidic Jews that he was opposed to. The Vilna Gaon is quoted as having homiletically understood the verse, "You shall not close your hand against your destitute brother." This is the quote from the Torah that talks about tzedakah. You shall not close your hand against your destitute brother, as an instruction about the evaluative responsibility contained within the tzedakah imperative. When the hand is closed in a fist, all the fingers appear to be the same size. However, when the hand is open, it becomes clear that the fingers are all of different length. Similarly, the appearance of objectivity in tzedakah standards is deceptive. In real life, appropriate giving will always require a judgment call based on the subjective elements. In other words, this whole session was kind of a waste. When I said, what counts as tzedakah? Do charitable donations count? Do disease cures count? And all of that. The Vilna Gaon says it's so complicated. You can't have any firm rules. You got to make judgment. It's always going to be a judgment call. To me, this is me giving you permission. If you think it feels like tzedakah, call it tzedakah. It's fine with me, and it should be fine with you and anyone else. However, none of these traditional sources dealt with institutions which are now the major recipients of charitable funds, such as vocational institutions, special education units, social service agencies, hospitals. In other words, the earlier Jewish communities faced so many basic needs that other matters could not be considered, right? Everyone talking about tzedakah is assuming that a poor person is going to knock on your door and ask for money, or there's going to be a beggar in the street. It's not institutional, although we did have that one little section about community leaders who distribute it. So there's a little bit of hint of institutional tzedakah. We may conclude from this tradition the tradition provides little guidance for our age, especially as we have been fortunate enough to overcome the basic problems of previous ages. All sources agree that communities need primary education, sick care, and centers of higher learning. Okay, this is not my opinion. The paragraph I just read is a CCAR responsive, priorities in charitable distribution. Okay, responsum. Um, there's a long tradition in Judaism. People have questions about the right way to be Jewish. And they frequently go to the local rabbi and say, "Hey, rabbi, should I be doing this? Is this okay?" A million questions. And the local rabbi says, "Hold on, I'll get back to you." And they'll write to some rabbi with the authority to make rulings, or in more modern times, the different movements have responsa committees where a group of rabbis will agree to address questions like that. So let's say you have a question, does donating to a political party count as tzedakah? You write a letter to the responsa committee in the Reform movement, which was once called the CCAR, the Central Committee of, what did it stand for? American Reform. I think they've changed their name since then. But at any rate, and then they'll study the text, they'll look at the Talmud, and they'll look at the Shulchan Aruch, and they'll argue for a while, and they'll write, hopefully, an authoritative answer to that question. That's called a responsum, plural responsum. So this is it. Somebody wrote to them and said, what should be my priorities in giving tzedakah? And they did a bunch of research, and their conclusion is all of our classic sources, the world was so different back then that we can't really draw conclusions based on what they did. We need to make our own judgments about this, which is kind of what the Vilna Gaon was saying 300 years ago, and he was Orthodox. Anyway, so that's going to be my final conclusion is if it feels like tzedakah to you, there's no bad way to give tzedakah. Just do it. Don't worry about what counts and what doesn't. It was a surprising conclusion. That's not where I expected to wind up when I first started doing this research. Before I finish, I want to give some credits. Starting with, well, Safaria.org. I hope you all know about that. That's the website with all kinds of Jewish text in it. So a lot of the text that I was quoting from, I copied and pasted from Safaria. By the way, I think donating money to Safaria.org should count as tzedakah, especially if we consider it to be a center of higher learning, as the CCAR response says. Also, a book, Making a Difference, Priorities in Tzedakah by Rabbi Daniel Z. Feldman. Ahavat Chesed, I quoted from that a lot by the Chafetz Chaim. And I want to give a little plug to Jewish Responser Radio. I say available on iTunes. I don't think iTunes even exists anymore, but Jewish Responser Radio is a podcast. I still download it from Apple through their podcast app. They bill themselves as answers to halakha questions in modern times. It's a couple of rabbis. They take questions from people. I once sent them a question and they answered it. And they do kind of what we did here. They go back to the original texts. They look for competing opinions. Usually the podcasts are 20 to 30 minutes. I really enjoy them. It's put out by an organization called Hadar, which trains rabbis. It's not really clear to me what movement they belong to. They seem to be conservadox, if that's a word. Anyway, um, thank you for listening to this study session. Hold on a second. Let me stop the screen share. Um, Thank you for listening to this. I hope you found it at least entertaining, maybe even a little bit educational. I plan on doing many more in the future.